My name is Kevin, and I would like to introduce our third speaker of the morning, Dr. Sandra Dedesko, whose work sits at the intersection of public health and engineering. She's an emerging expert on improving the health and sustainability of the indoor or built environment. Dr. Dedesko is a professional engineer with a background in civil engineering and building design. Driven to more fully integrate health into the built environment, she pursued a PhD at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Her doctoral research, conducted with Dr. Joseph Allen's Healthy Buildings team, examined the links between buildings and cognitive performance. While in Boston, she also deepened her technical expertise through MIT's Building Technology program. She's now a scientist at EPFL in Switzerland, where she continues her interdisciplinary research and works to translate scientific findings into real-world impact. We're delighted to have her here with us today to provide her expert insights on the connections between the environments we build and our health. Without further ado, I would introduce you all to Dr. Sandra Dedesko. And Sandra, you can take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Kevin. And thanks everyone for being here and having me today. I'm really excited to talk to you about how buildings shape us, looking at indoor exposures, health outcomes, and built environment interventions. So nice to meet you all. As Kevin just gave you the full background on me, my name is Sandra. I'm currently here in Switzerland, and mainly this is my email address if you have any questions that come up after today. Just a little bit more about my professional background. So as Kevin said, I started in civil engineering, and my original focus was on sustainable buildings, how to make them more energy efficient. And then I also did a master's in civil engineering, and the focus was on indoor air quality, still on the engineering side of things, but this got me really interested in how different indoor exposures and building design strategies impact human health. So after my master's, I worked for about 6 years in various roles in design consulting. And I started my professional career actually in Australia, not at a design firm, but it was an occupational and environmental health consulting firm. And they were surprised. They said, we don't really get many engineers, but it was a really good fit. So I think that was just another link to trying to understand occupational environmental health and exposures and how that links to the built environment, which, as Kevin already said, is what really motivated me to go finally pursue formal training with Dr. Joseph Allen at the School of Public Health at Harvard, where I could still focus on the built environment in his Healthy Buildings team while getting that proper environmental health, public health training. And so here I am now in Switzerland, trying to combine both worlds, both civil engineering and public health. It's not always the most straightforward path, but I'm really grateful for opportunities like this where I can work across fields and meet people from different expertise to see how we can work together and learn from each other. So today's presentation, it's going to be, I would say, quite broad. We're going to start with a motivation for why the built environment matters with respect to human health. Then an overview of different indoor environmental exposures you'll encounter. So as I already said, my expertise is really on indoor air quality, but we're going to look beyond that and do a survey of the common indoor exposures, their sources, and their links to different health outcomes. Then finally, we'll discuss health in a little more detail, primarily with two examples from the research world from Dr. Joseph Allen's Healthy Buildings team. So I'll highlight my work on the link between buildings and cognitive performance, and then speak about the research of another colleague, Dr. Anna Young, who focuses on healthier materials and the impacts on health and the endocrine system. Next, we'll look at interventions, so a brief overview of simple strategies that you can recommend to help reduce indoor exposures and improve health. And we'll also do a few case studies in this section. And then finally, a bit of time for Q&A. But as I said, feel free to email me afterwards if anything comes up later. The learning objectives for today. So at the conclusion of this activity, participants will be able to identify common indoor environmental exposures and their sources. Participants will also be able to understand how these exposures link to health outcomes. And finally, participants will be able to assess built environment interventions to reduce exposures and ideally improve health. So kicking things right off with a motivation for why the built environment matters. As many of you probably know, we've had this long-term epidemiologic transition where there's been this movement away from the burden of disease, primarily caused by communicable disease, to non-communicable disease, or NCDs, caused by a number of different factors in our lives. And while a lot of people, maybe outside of this audience, maybe more in my kind of engineering friend group, a lot of people think that the things that determine our health primarily are genetics or maybe the medical care we receive. We probably know that it's a lot more complicated than that. And it's things like our lifestyle behaviors, our built and physical environment. So this is where the building part really comes in, and many social factors. Some of these social factors do tie into the built environment, but we won't be talking about those in detail today, mostly on the actual physical environmental exposures in buildings. And so back when I was still working in engineering, I went to a health in buildings roundtable at the National Institutes of Health. And the opening plenary speaker started the session by saying this quote that your zip code is a better predictor of your health than your genetic code. And that's true for a number of reasons. A lot of that is really has to do with those social determinants of health. But the buildings that we spend time in and the spaces and communities really do have a sharp impact on our everyday exposures and health. And maybe zooming in a little more from, say, like the built environment, these like large urban areas or rural areas, even to specific buildings, the typical North American will spend over 90% of their time indoors. And you can see that almost 70% is just in one's personal residence, especially these days after COVID, with more and more people working at home. The home and other indoor environments really dominate our exposure time. And that in turn has a large impact on our health. And some of these things might be obvious to you. Like if we look at this picture, there are certain things you'll pick up on, like, okay, there's views to nature and daylight, the different materials and finishing, they all have a certain vibe or aesthetic that does actually have a link to health. But you might think, for example, if you see my background, it looks kind of boring. You'll be like, okay, nothing's really happening in there. But beyond what we can see or even feel, there's a lot happening that's invisible to us. So it could be things like here, for example, a damp, cold corner where there could be mold growth and mycotoxins released. It could be outdoor air coming in and bringing in pollution, adding a unique microbial fingerprint, much like the occupants of the space. So humans, pets, they all have a distinct microbial signature. And all of these things happening in these seemingly boring, kind of static spaces really do shape a lot of these invisible exposures that can really influence us in a myriad of ways. And people have picked up on this for a long time now. Like this presentation would not be complete without this quote by Winston Churchill. We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. This actually had to do with more of the formation, like the arrangement of people in a space and the type of, I guess, dialogue or aggressive dialogue between people in debates and how the building influences even the tone and the interactions of people. But beyond even that observation, there have been many healthy building pioneers. So John Snow, for example, or Max von Pettenkofer and Florence Nightingale promoting the need for ventilation. And beyond that, not really knowing the science yet, but noticing that outdoor air, fresh air, some people would call it, seem to have benefits for health, for healing, these types of things. However, beyond that, the timeline or the history of healthy buildings hasn't been so linear or straightforward. So around the 1940s, we have this chemical revolution where there's all sorts of new miracle building materials and consumer products that just seem to solve all of our problems. And there's really fast adoption without much knowledge about the potential consequences to the environment or our health effects. And then beyond that, we have kind of the next big thing in buildings, which is the energy crisis around the 1970s, where this push to help reduce energy, reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, promotes new energy efficient building strategies. And not long after that, interestingly, the World Health Organization recognizes sick building syndrome, this kind of phenomenon where there's all sorts of low levels of irritation, brain fog, fatigue, like that 3 p.m. kind of exhaustion slump at your desk. These types of maybe not so serious health conditions, but these kind of low level irritation, sensory problems, they're starting to notice more and more, not surprisingly, with these increasingly airtight buildings that don't breathe, with all of these miracle materials inside, kind of increasing our exposure to chemicals, air pollutants, these types of things. Then I would say it's not an exact year, but around the 2010s, early 2010s, we start to see this healthy buildings movement come into place where there's been decades of push to reduce energy consumption in buildings and maybe at the expense of our health. Now there's this kind of new movement that's trying to bring health into the picture. So we see healthy building certification systems. If anyone on the call has heard of the WELL Building Standard or Fitwell, these were starting to hit the market in the early 2010s. And instead of providing strategies for buildings to save energy, they were now providing strategies to improve indoor air quality, movement in buildings, access to nature. All of these things really focused on promoting health. And then a few years later, I swear I'm not biased. This was one of the reasons why I sought out to work with Dr. Allen at Harvard as well. But Dr. Allen's Healthy Buildings team at Harvard published this series of studies called the COG-FX series, which was the link between buildings and cognitive function. And I was still working in design at the time and had never seen such interest in the private sector in academic research. And so these new papers that the team had published showing this very clear link between indoor air quality and improved cognitive performance among office workers was really motivating for the design community to start mobilizing and improving indoor air quality and health. And also the proliferation of new technologies in buildings, such as low-cost environmental monitors, to really try to understand like the pulse and heartbeat of the buildings themselves. So I will say like a personal anecdote at the time, I had finished my master's in indoor air quality in 2015 and thought it was the coolest thing ever. And when I told people what I studied, they were like, oh, okay, interesting, you know? And then not too long after in 2020, COVID-19 hits and all of a sudden there's an indoor air emergency. And indoor air quality is one of the most important things on everyone's mind. And there's just this rapid increase in awareness. At the same time, in 2020, I start my PhD in public health and people ask what I'm focusing on. And I tell them indoor air quality. And they're like, oh my gosh, most important topic. Good for you. That's amazing. So the shift and the focus has really increased now in 2020, and much more people are concerned about indoor air quality and the health impacts of their spaces. So we've gotten to this point where we have increased awareness. I would say now that the pandemic has, tapered off and everyone's kind of more or less back to their somewhat normal lives, their new normal lives. I would say the front of mind awareness has probably dwindled a bit. But what about the action too? So people are maybe more aware, but in terms of action on healthy buildings, it's really been quite minimal. So maybe in the early 1900s, that's when we start to see the healthy building pioneers first start to translate these theories about indoor spaces into the first standards. So ventilation targets to bring outdoor air inside buildings at certain rates to promote health. But then over the years, we see these again start to diminish in favor of energy saving strategies. So the health-based standards, they start, but then they start to dwindle. We see other strategies to protect health and safety indoors, with say the OSHA Act in 1970. But again, this is very focused on workspaces, target workers. It's not a kind of pervasive intervention in the built environment. And then going on with this healthy buildings movement, we really see this in the form of voluntary rating systems. So it's really rare that this will be mandatory. And enforcement is also not widespread or regulated. So the landscape right now is we have these voluntary certification systems where some buildings will adopt them if they're really interested in health or being a market leader. We have some new design guidelines from COVID-19, but again, they're voluntary and I would say probably aspirational for a lot of buildings. So one of the big challenges we have right now is we have increased knowledge, we have new scientific research, we have increased public awareness, but uptake and enforcement remain significant challenges. And that's where an audience like yourself really comes in, because there's an incredible opportunity to try to help push healthy buildings and the health promoting benefits of them. So I would say the general building stock right now, talking largely about buildings, not specialized workplaces with heightened risk, it's a pervasive but underutilized intervention. And what I love so much about buildings and their potential is that if we consider the average uptake and adherence to, say, a clinical intervention, maybe it's taking a certain type of medication at a certain schedule, or maybe it's following a certain diet or exercise routine that's supposed to help with a certain chronic disease, we'll see anywhere from, roughly 20 to 70% uptake. So not ideal. But with a healthy building, what's so exciting is that just by designing a building to be healthier, have lower exposures, be promoting for the occupants, just by them spending time in that space. And remember, they're going to spend most of their time, over 90% of their time indoors. You'll get 100% uptake and the benefits of that building just by them being there. So that's what's been so motivating for me about engineering and now trying to merge engineering and public health. So as I said, it's this really great opportunity to take buildings, which at the moment, a lot of them really aren't optimized for health. And so a lot of them do cause kind of this malaise and low-level ill health. It's a real opportunity to help take them from prevention and also towards promotion in a number of ways. And so moving on now, we're going to do a quick overview of the different indoor exposures that one would encounter in a typical building. So again, this is like a regular office, maybe a work from home office environment, a school. It's not a type of industrial workspace. Obviously, the exposures are going to be heightened in those types of settings. And so for each of these exposures, we're going to talk about common sources, common exposure categories, and then some common health outcomes. And so just so you know, this is not exhaustive by any means. There's no way we could cover it all. These are just examples, and I've tried to categorize them into the large buckets for each. But if you have any specific questions, I'm more than happy to chat afterwards or via email. So as I said, indoor spaces, you have many different exposures, and some of them are more obvious than others. So you and I are probably more intuitive and familiar with things like thermal conditions. Is it too hot or cold? Is it too noisy? Definitely not here in Switzerland. It's like the opposite. It's so quiet. Access to daylight or the type of artificial light you have in your space. These are the more obvious intuitive things. But then we have other things like indoor air quality, which, even myself, an indoor air quality scientist, it's hard for me to try to even determine myself what I'm exposed to. We have indoor water and moisture, two important distinctions there. And then finally, materials and surfaces in the space. So kicking things off with my favorite, this is indoor air quality. Common sources, I've categorized them as outdoor air. So depending on the outdoor pollution and how it infiltrates through the building, through the envelope, that's the exterior walls, depending on its quality, and the mechanical systems, that will bring a certain portion of outdoor pollution indoors. Then we have building materials and consumer products. So depending on how the building was constructed, maybe there was healthier material selection, lower emitting materials, lower chemical components in the materials. That's a new movement in the building design and certification process. And then a lot of it is really up to the occupants and what they bring into the space, whether it's fragrance products, candles, which is a source of indoor combustion, these types of things. And then people themselves, we're a primary source. You and I emit plenty of gaseous pollutants. We have distinct microbial fingerprints that we leave in spaces. And then everything we do from, cleaning to cooking, we're introducing chemicals, particles, combustion, all sorts of things into the spaces. And the typical exposures, I categorize them into really simple distinctions. So it's particles and gases. And beyond that, within the particles category, you'll have them across a size range. So the ultrafine, the really small ones being most concerning, but also understudied for health, since they can get really, really deep into the respiratory system, the bloodstream, even into the olfactory route, into the nervous system, towards larger particles. You've got your PM 2.5s, your fine particles that are serious for health problems and respiratory disease, and then the coarser particles that can take the form depending on what the composition of is as well. So we were just talking about size there, but also the source, whether it's, from outdoors, there's like a wildfire, if it's indoor combustion from cooking, if it's pollen, these types of things, the composition also determines the health impact. And then with gases, we have just a plethora of them. So there's volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. This is just so many different compounds, gases in the air. Some of them, there's no marker or no evidence of a health impact. Some of them, like formaldehyde, you'll be familiar with, is more serious for health. So various gases, various health impact. We have nitrogen dioxide from indoor combustion, which is you're probably familiar with, more of a hot topic these days from indoor gas cooking, residential combustion appliances, and links to things like asthma, respiratory disease. And then from my work with Dr. Allen, we see increasing evidence of impacts on cognitive health. So maybe short-term exposures, acute exposures linking to cognitive performance, but also concerns over more chronic neurodegenerative disease as well. Moving on to water and moisture. The main sources in buildings will be the water supply system. So that can be anywhere from the water source through the treatment process, through the piping, all the way to the outlets. And so actually this was one case when I was starting my career in Australia, where we had a lot of problems with not the water supply itself, but the actual dispensers and the conditions the water was being held at, and leading to some microbial contamination there. So it can be anywhere in the water system. That can be one source. Mechanical systems are another problem in certain areas where you can have standing water that leads to mold growth, or say cooling towers, for example, in more commercial type buildings on the roof, where depending on the conditions and how the water is standing, and then all that water that gets aerosolized and distributed can really spread microbes in different spaces. And then finally, we have leaks, moisture, and condensation indoors, which can be pretty tricky to track down if it's not like an obvious leak. And that can have many, many impacts in turn. So the two exposure categories I'd say for this one are water quality. So within the water itself, there can be dissolved metals, minerals, things like this that can affect the taste properties or the health impacts. And then microbials are another concern, both in the water supply, but as I mentioned, also what can grow in the systems or on building surfaces, depending if there's a moisture problem in the building itself. And in terms of health impacts, some typical ones we see are bone health, particularly with teeth, say, for example, with fluoride in the water or not, neurotoxicity in extreme cases with some dissolved metals, and then respiratory disease. For example, of particular interest is Legionnaire's disease from Legionella growing in certain points in the water distribution system. Moving on to materials, common sources are the indoor finishes, furniture, and then products that people bring into the spaces. And this can get really, really complicated because there's many things to pay attention to. So one of the more traditional ones is like physical hazards, say asbestos and lead. And so really this has been phased out in a lot of buildings. It's more of an issue for older buildings or heritage buildings if there is remediation or renovation work going where these physical hazards can be disturbed and people can be exposed. But with newer buildings and products, we see things like immediate off-gassing, those VOCs, volatile organic compounds that I mentioned earlier. Those will migrate pretty quickly out of newly installed products. You can get lower VOC products, and there is research confirming that they are indeed lower emitting. But one issue that we're seeing a lot of, especially with the real chemists and material experts, is persistent chemicals and these classes of bioaccumulating chemicals that we're seeing in consumer products, and they migrate out much more slowly over time in the building. Oh, yep, sorry.
Sorry, I think we lost your audio for just a second
Yes,
there.
just for a second. Yes.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, now you're back.
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Would you like me to repeat anything if something?
Maybe.
Maybe the last sentence or two.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Thanks.
That's very weird. Okay, so I think hopefully I was talking about VOCs and immediate off-gassing. And I was saying that when you bring new materials into a space, the VOCs, those volatile organic compounds, off-gas more quickly. But then we have in a lot of more like furniture products, carpets, these things, these persistent classes of chemicals that more readily bioaccumulate. And so this is becoming an increasing problem, often with substitutions. Like if, say, PFAS a product is labeled PFAS free, they're often replaced with another type of persistent bioaccumulating chemical. And these migrate out much more slowly over time and are proving to be a new environmental health concern with increasing attention. And so some of the health effects that you could see from these indoor materials, again, it could be respiratory disease. So in really severe cases, for example, with asbestos exposure, you could see things like mesothelioma or lung cancer. With the immediate off-gassing of VOCs, you're more likely to see something like sensory irritation or a sore throat or watery eyes, depending on the person's sensitivity. And then with these persistent chemicals, we're seeing things like endocrine disruption and thyroid dysregulation. So this is a growing concern that we'll also talk about more in the case study later. Moving on to light. So your indoor sources are a little more intuitive here. You basically in buildings have daylight access and then artificial lighting, whether it's from an actual like light source, like a light bulb or a task lamp, or if it's something like your cell phone or your electronics that are giving you that blue light exposure that we all dread so much. And then in terms of the exposures for light, it's really categorized into different components of the light. So there's the quantity of light. If more technically, that would be like the illuminance, so the intensity of the light. Then you have various quality factors. So this can be things like the spectrum, which translates to the color temperature. So that blue light is more of a blue hue, but in the morning and the evening, for example, we'd want to be exposed to a warmer, like a redder hue of light. And then there are other things like flicker of the light or the contrast between surfaces that's important to pay attention to for things like eye strain. And finally, the timing is crucial as well. Like I just mentioned, that in the morning versus the midday versus the evening, the quality of the light and the intensity that you want to be exposed to changes. Because light, as you probably know, really impacts your circadian rhythm, which in turn has a number of consequences, whether it's sleep quality and quantity, metabolic health, all of these things. It's really important to try to regulate your exposure to light in the same way you would naturally with the pattern of the sun, to try to regulate that circadian rhythm and the cascading effects on all of these other bodily systems that it has. Next, moving on to thermal exposures. The three main sources or kind of factors that control your thermal exposures in buildings are the passive systems. So that's your exterior walls, the quality of its insulation, how much air it lets through, and the windows and how much daylight it lets through those solar gains, how they heat and cool the space. Then beyond that, you may or may not have active systems. Even though I claim to be this healthy buildings expert, the number of places I've lived in without proper like heating systems or air conditioning is quite remarkable. So hopefully you have active systems like air conditioning, a furnace, a radiator that can help you control that indoor temperature. And then finally, we have internal gains. So you and I are emitting heat into the space, electronics, light, all of these things. And in terms of exposures, a lot of people think of thermal conditions mostly in terms of temperature and maybe relative humidity. But the other two environmental factors we have to consider are airspeed and then also radiant energy. So people I find are typically less familiar with this, but basically you and I, every surface at Earth is exchanging radiant energy with each other. So for example, if you're sitting next to a cold window, you probably feel that net exchange, like you feel that kind of cold draft sensation. A lot of that has to do with that radiant, that shortwave energy exchange between you and the surfaces around you. And so each of these, we consider them individually, but they also work collectively to influence the thermoregulation processes, your overall feeling, and what that does to various systems. So obviously there's impacts on the renal system and health. This can happen in more, I would say, extreme heat situations. If someone is in a building where they don't have proper cooling control or shelter from the heat, you can start to see dehydration, dysregulation of different systems. Then also in Dr. Allen's group, there's been some really cool research linking heat exposure to decrease cognitive performance, again, in learning environments without air conditioning. And then, of course, you and I probably know this one quite well. Like if the thermal conditions are too hot, too cold, the sleep is totally dysregulated. And again, cascading effects from that. Finally, we have acoustics. And so the common sources are noise from outdoors. I'm sure we've all experienced this somewhere. Buildings, maybe
I,
some like,
I think,
did I?
oh, sorry, Sandra. I think we
Yeah.
lost your audio again for just like one or two sentences.
Okay. I'm
Uh,
so sorry about this. I don't know what's going on.
No problem.
Um, okay. I'll start with acoustics again. But the three common sources are noise from outdoors. So you and I have probably all experienced this where there's noise coming in through, say, the windows, the walls. These are called flanking paths. So the sound, much like heat transfer, the sound finds a path to transfer and will find its way indoors or through walls, up and down. Depending if you're in an apartment building with neighbors up and down, it'll find a way to annoy you. Then we have building systems. So you might sometimes hear this kind of like low level background noise. It could be the fan from an HVAC system. It could be an electrical system, and you hear this high frequency sound. And then we have internal activities. So everyone's probably familiar with like a noisy neighbor that is like stomping around, or maybe a dog or a cat. Many sources of indoor noise to cause irritation, but it's not just noise itself. Much like light, it can be categorized into different components. So there's the decibel, which is, you can think of it as like just how loud it is. There's frequency, so this has to do with the pitch. And I don't have to tell you, something high pitched is probably a lot more annoying to you than something lower pitched. And then there's also the speech intelligibility of the sound. So how clearly you can make out words, conversation, these types of things. And why all of this matters, sound is an interesting one. Like obviously there's the irritation that you feel from it, but then that impacts your kind of overall allostatic load or your stress, which can lead to cardiovascular strain, disrupted sleep, and again, this cascade of kind of low-level ill health effects that can build over time. And then now that we've gone over the exposures, the sources, and some sample health impacts at a really high, broad level, I wanted to dive in and just provide a few more detailed case studies from the research in Dr. Allen's Healthy Buildings team while I was there. So I'm going to start with indoor air quality. This is some work from my dissertation, where it started actually kind of like a twofold project. So basically, we were in charge of doing some risk monitoring on campus to install continuous environmental monitors to understand indoor air quality and the potential for COVID infection risk on campus. And so while we were doing this, we thought, you know what, why not also try to make a study out of it? So we have this smartphone-based research app on Dr. Allen's team, which is super cool. It allows you to engage and connect with study participants remotely and in many different ways. So the goal of this project was, of course, number one, COVID risk management and working with the facilities teams to make sure Harvard buildings were healthy. But number two was to build on this COG-FX, or cognitive function in buildings, research theme that Dr. Allen's group had already established before I was there. So they had already looked at indoor environmental quality in a lab, in offices, and then like globally in 6 different countries. And then my component was now to do a study in the classroom, which we called Classroom COG-FX. Oops, sorry. So basically, we now have this exposure data, these continuous monitors, and they provide real-time continuous measurements of temperature, humidity, carbon dioxide, and actually many other indoor pollutants not shown here, but fine particulate matter, coarse particulate matter, those volatile organic compounds that I mentioned. So it's quite cool, and maybe of interest to you is that more and more buildings are starting to implement these sensors as they become lower cost and higher quality. And so it is quite often actually that before we wouldn't know much about buildings or be able to diagnose an environmental exposure of concern, but this type of information is becoming more and more available. And so that allows us to make better insights for how the building might be impacting health. In terms of the data from our study participants, we were again focused on cognitive performance. So we sent them some short cognitive activities at the end of class. So this was the Stroop test, where they basically have to suppress dominant information and select the less dominant information. So it's kind of this interference inhibitory control type of test. And then we have a basic arithmetic test, which is just simple addition and subtraction that we're much more familiar with. And then we also asked them a short survey to get information on other factors we were interested in studying for facilities management, other components of our papers, but also an exposure ascertainment question to make sure they were actually in class exposed to the conditions we were measuring, since there was much more hybrid learning after COVID-19 and much less attendance. So throughout the semester, not just for our research study, but we were monitoring the indoor conditions and advising facilities teams if we noticed something that needed to be altered, or if for example, if the carbon dioxide levels indicated maybe a problem with the building ventilation. So carbon dioxide, it's primarily emitted from you and I. And then the ventilation systems, they have this demand controlled ventilation, or DCV. And basically, depending on the carbon dioxide concentrations, a lot of them will then increase ventilation or slow it down to try to control that indoor CO2. And when you control indoor CO2, you control a lot of other indoor air pollutants as well that are harder to measure. So CO2, it's not a complete indoor air measurement, but it's a really useful proxy for a lot of them, and also helps us understand how the building ventilation system is operating. So when we were looking at the data, from an operations perspective, it was incredible. Like, these are very, very low levels of CO2 compared to what you would see in a building. 1,000 parts per million is typically referred to as high performance. And so you can see the 75th percentile value here is just under 800 parts per million. So this is much lower than you would expect to see in a lot of buildings. And a lot of buildings have trouble achieving that 1,000 parts per million. So this is a very high performance situation we were looking at, which is again great since the classrooms have this increased ventilation for COVID-19 infection control and risk management. Fantastic. From a study perspective, not so great because your exposure range is so tight. You're wondering if you're even going to see anything in your data. And so we ran a bunch of regression models, special types of regression models, to try to understand how indoor CO2 exposures, serving as this kind of proxy for indoor air quality in general, how it's influencing these cognitive performance metrics. And when we looked at peak classroom concentrations in association with the scores, we saw this really consistent pattern reaching statistical significance at the 0.05 alpha level in most cases. And so I'm just going to first orient you to all of the different graphs. These are the, let's call them the effect estimates for the different scores that we looked at. So here we have that Stroop test, the first test I mentioned, where the participants have to suppress this tendency to select dominant information and select the less dominant information instead. So on the left, we have responses to all those Stroop trials. And then here to its right, we have a more challenging set of Stroop trials, so just a harder version of the same test. And then on the right, we have the responses in this column from just those simple addition and subtraction trials. The top row then for all of these tests is called throughput. And this is the number of correct responses per time. And then on the bottom, we just have response time. So no indication of whether or not the response was correct, just how quickly it was done. But overall, we see this, regardless of test or metric, we see this consistent pattern where we have an increase in CO2 leading to a decrease in throughput. And then on the bottom row, we have this increase in CO2 being associated with this increase in response time, so slowed response times. And overall, we see across all 6 patterns, most reaching statistical significance, that an increase in CO2, and if we say like roughly a 100 parts per million increase in CO2, we see this approximate 5% decrease in cognitive function scores. And so this was really interesting because not only did we see that indoor air quality could be used as a proxy for ventilation, which can be useful for understanding infection risk, but we also see the benefits beyond infection risk reduction, looking at improved cognitive performance in these students in these really high functioning rooms. So one of the big takeaways from the overall CogFX series has been that even good buildings can be better. And so even when we try to work for prevention, we can often move towards health promotion. So it's really kind of win-win there. Next, I wanted to move on to, this is the research, the healthier materials research, primarily led by Dr. Young. She's now a professor herself, but this was when she was still on the team, and this was incredible work she did. So it's not my expertise, but I really wanted to highlight it. She looked at various healthier materials interventions on campus. So she was looking at spaces that had no healthier materials, a partial healthier material fit out in the, this was focused on furniture. So furniture that was labeled, for example, lower persistent chemicals, different certifications. And then finally, there was like a full material fit out. So they removed any furniture that didn't have this like healthier consideration, healthier label. And then they took dust samples in the different spaces. And across the board, they found that chemical concentrations decreased with the presence of healthier material interventions in the spaces. She went on to look at different methods to detect different chemicals. So, for example, looking at levels of organic fluorine as a proxy for PFAS, this group of chemicals that some are known, some are unknown, but have many concerning health effects. So she found different ways to assess exposures. And again, finding that healthier materials, we see lower overall fluorine concentrations. All of this being important because then her work went on to look at some of the dust samples and find that they were all chemical-laden dust samples were found to be hormonally active. So links to these types of things that we see with like thyroid dysregulation, endocrine disruption, showing how important it is for the biological processes. And this is not done by Dr. Allen's group, but it actually just came across in a newsletter to my inbox the other day. And I thought it was really interesting. Another group finding similar patterns where in California, they have an updated flammability standard for upholstered furniture. So flame retardant chemicals are very problematic again for bioaccumulation, but again, we're pushed into many, many consumer products. And there's a group out in California really working to help ban them. And so they ran a study where they collected serum and urine samples from two groups. So one group, they had removed furniture made before 2014, and the other group did not remove any furniture. And then 1 year later, they examined again the serum and the urine samples. And I thought this was so interesting that they found that PBDEs, so this other class of bioaccumulating chemicals, decreased 1.9 to 3.9 times faster in people who removed the furniture. So this is, really trying to push policy forward. But again, I think it's really motivating, and I like to bring this research back to the design community. It's really motivating that even when there isn't policy present to try to make consumer products healthier, there's still steps that can be taken. Changing all your furniture might be a little more challenging, but still it's very motivating evidence when the opportunity is there. And this leads us nicely into interventions. So like I said, not everyone can just change out their furniture, but I wanted to highlight a few simple strategies and then also do a few case studies to show like how the built environment can be considered in interventions and health. So there's some more low-hanging fruit, I say like easy to adopt interventions. One thing is to switch consumer products to fragrance-free versions because a lot of the fragrance that you see in consumer products like cleaning sprays, soaps, these types of things, the chemicals aren't detailed and the effects on health are not fully understood. And so a lot of people have these fragrance or chemical sensitivities. The irritation lowers when they switch to a fragrance-free version. I was just talking about healthier materials. Changing your furniture is expensive, time consuming, like very few people can do all of that, but there are more simple swaps you can do. For example, cooking with products like cast iron, stainless steel, as opposed to things with like stick resistant coatings and these types of chemicals that can then very easily leach out of the product and into you either directly or into the food and bioaccumulate that way. Filtration is another great option. So if you live in a house or have an office where there is a filter in the main system that you can replace with a higher efficiency filter that can remove more particles from the air, that's a great option. If you're like me and you've never been able to do that, you can get a standalone air cleaner or air purifier, as most people say, and keep it close to you to try to make that breathing zone a lot cleaner. And then one of my favorite ones, I'm not a lighting expert, but adjusting lighting for circadian rhythm can really have a positive impact. You don't need to spend money on a full tunable circadian system. They do make those, but it's more for commercial type buildings, and many of those clients don't even have the budget. So just paying attention to things like the bulb selection. You can look for something like the color correlated temperature, that's CCT. And you can choose something like a warmer hue for maybe the bedroom where you're trying to like wind down in the evening and not disrupt your sleep. Or in a workspace or an area where someone needs to be very alert and focused, you can go towards one of those cooler colors that helps stimulate alertness and focused work. And then I wanted to move on to a few case studies. I'm no doctor, but I thought it would be maybe helpful to walk through how this could be incorporated into perhaps clinical practice. So for our first scenario, we have Tommy. He's a 7-year-old boy who lives in a really tidy house with his parents. They don't have a dog. They're really trying hard to clean the house and frustrated because it's spotless. But Tommy is he's recently been diagnosed with asthma and seems to be having a lot of flare-ups, getting particularly worse in the winter months. And so they come to you for help. Knowing that indoor combustion and gas stoves are actually responsible for quite a bit of childhood asthma. So in the last few years, there's been quite a bit of research on this, and it's estimated that if you cook with a gas stove at home regularly, there's a 42% increased risk of pediatric asthma. And currently it's estimated that indoor natural gas stoves are responsible for approximately 13% of pediatric asthma cases in the US. So that's your initial suspicion that, Tommy is recently diagnosed with asthma in this house, this fairly new house, and it seems to be getting worse in the winter. So you start to ask Tommy's parents if they have any combustion appliances at home, and they say yes, they have this natural gas stove. So you ask them things about the stove, like if they have a range hood that vents to the outside. Most people, even engineers, won't know what that means, whether the air goes outside or whether it recirculates back. But you can ask them other things like, oh, do you use the hood? Do you open windows? Do you think it's effective? And by effective, you can ask them like, do smells linger? Is there like noticeable kind of like smoke or haze in the air? And most people won't be able to answer your technical questions, but most people also don't use their range hoods. So they might say, no, what are you talking about? Like, I don't really use that. Maybe in the summer they open their windows, but in the winter they don't. And so that's why you're seeing increased indoor air pollution and asthma symptoms inside. And then finally, you can ask about Tommy's proximity to the source, the gas stove, and the symptom timing. So in this case, it turns out that his bedroom is really close to the kitchen, and he also does his homework after school at the kitchen table. And his symptoms seem to get worse in the evening after he's been home from school and his parents have been cooking. And so in this case, some of the low-level building interventions you could recommend are to use ventilation. That could be the range hood. A lot of them really aren't effective, but it could just be opening the windows if it's feasible with the outdoor conditions. And it's important to do that before, during, and after cooking. That can really help lower indoor air pollution. And it sounds really simple and silly, but there's actually been quite a bit of research showing that most people don't use the range hood because they just think it's not necessary. And that actually using it properly during cooking can lower those indoor nitrogen dioxide levels below certain thresholds set for health concerns. If it's really bad and the ventilation is not working, you could consider even suggesting a single burner plug-in induction plate. So like not a full appliance switch. That would be the final recommendation if people had the budget, but it's not very realistic. So you can even switch to a single induction plate instead of using that gas combustion indoors. And then for case number 2, this one's a little trickier. We have Rebecca. She's a 32-year-old tech worker. And she recently started a new job in a very cool tech startup. And of course, they are in a renovated heritage office downtown. She's really been enjoying the job, but since the winter months rolled in, she's noticed many upper and lower respiratory systems like an irritated throat, wheezing, chest congestion, other things too, like watery, itchy eyes, a headache, and general brain fog. And she thinks she might just be like burnt out from this tech startup life and in need of a holiday. So you're not quite sure what it is. These symptoms could be a lot of things, but the fact that she's in a heritage building and the symptoms got worse during the winter tell you that perhaps it's something to do with the cold and how the building is interacting with the cold outdoor conditions and maybe the warmer indoor conditions. So you ask her things about the onset, timing, and severity of symptoms, and she confirms that it got worse during the winter. Also, that typically when she's away on vacation, traveling for work, or at home on the weekend, her symptoms seem to get better, and that it's often worse at the start of the week. So, again, this is a little tricky to decipher. It could be many things, but you know that moisture in the winter is a particular problem. And so, one of the easiest ways to figure that out is to ask if she's noticed any smells in the office. So maybe it might be an air pollutant exposure, or maybe it is mold related. So if it's mold or moisture related, you'd ask her if there's any like musty or earthy smell in the office. And she says, well, yes, actually, she's noticed that at a low level. And then you ask her if she's noticed any visible signs of moisture, like leaks. She says no. But that's the really tricky part, is that often in that earlier animated graphic where you had that kind of damp corner and all those mycotoxins coming off, moisture often isn't visible. And it often happens in the winter in these older buildings that aren't properly insulated or have really low insulation windows. You can get condensation on the windows, in the walls. And then from that, you can have mycotoxins, endotoxins, allergy proliferation, allergen growth and proliferation, all of these things. So that's one of the trickiest things about moisture, is that even though when we see indoor moisture, we see links to all sorts of health problems, but the pathways are not fully understood, and diagnosing the moisture and that actual pathway in the building can be really challenging. But still, if there are these kind of the musty, earthy smell, that's the primary one, and this kind of mixture of low-level symptoms is the other. Some of the interventions you could suggest are obviously trying to address the moisture problem. So check the surfaces. You can get these little attachments on your phone to do like a thermal image scan, and you can see cold surfaces where the moisture problem might be. You can try to dry the sources. If you just increase airflow with a cheap fan, that can help move heat around to help prevent this condensation. You can insulate, say, for example, with those window films that help in the winter, and also dehumidify if, say, for example, it's not a condensation problem, but a dampness in the overall air, say in like an underground space. And then you can increase filtration. Again, if you have a portable air cleaner or the opportunity in the main system to put a higher performing filter in, that can help remove maybe some of the things floating in the air as a result. You'll want to dry and clean the surfaces. So if the increase in moisture has led to an increase in allergens or say dust mites, these types of things, really cleaning the surfaces, vacuuming if there's carpet will help. And then, as I said, this can be a more challenging one. So coordinating with facility management in the building can also be helpful. They'll probably have better tools to diagnose and remediate the problem. And then just to summarize today what we've talked about. So the motivation for the built environment, we spend over 90% of our time indoors. And even if it is just kind of a boring building like behind me, it shapes much of our exposures and health merely from the time we spend here. We talked about indoor air quality, both water quality and moisture in buildings, materials, light, thermal conditions, and acoustics, and common sources, exposures, and health outcomes. Even though there are numerous links to health outcomes, we only focused on a few case studies between indoor air quality and materials, and examples that can lead to both prevention and health promotion. And then finally, only a few quick examples of interventions and some case studies. But suggesting to ask questions about the indoor spaces, like I don't expect the medical community to all of a sudden become like building experts, but really asking questions like, where do you notice your symptoms flaring up, and trying to understand maybe the different buildings and some common sources in those buildings that could lead to health impacts, whether it is a pattern like at home it's okay, at the office or the workspace or the school it's a problem, and vice versa. And with that, I know that was a pretty high level overview, but I'm happy to take questions now as we have time. And like I said, feel free to email me later if anything else comes up or you have a specific question. I'm happy to chat more or try to link you to one of my colleagues who might even be specialized in an area you have interest in. So thank you all very much. And yeah, happy to chat more.
So I do see one question that was posed by Dr. Rose Goldman in the chat. I don't know. Dr. Dedesko? Are you able to see it? Or I can certainly kind of
Yes.
summarize.
Or I could just ask it if you want.
Sure.
Sure, I can see, but yeah.
All right. Well, I also want to make a comment. First of all, I love your pictures
Oh,
of the indoor. I also want to make a funny comment you might appreciate. In the 2000s, I was teaching an introduction to environmental health class and had about 75, 80 people in G1, okay, at Harvard School of Public Health. So
Yeah.
as an exercise, when we did indoor air quality, I thought it would be fun. We'd do measurements of CO2 at the front of the classroom in the back, just for fun. So what happened was we did the measurements, and I don't know if Josh Allen helped me with it or one of the other industrial hygienists. Anyway, the CO2 levels came back really high. So we thought it was a fluke, but then we did it again. So that actually triggered a whole issue for them to have to fix the air quality in those areas. So I thought you might like that little story.
I love it. Thank you. Yeah, it's always so fun. Like we did when we were setting up the sensors, we had a few cases where even I was like, no, this has to be a fluke. Like, what is that measurement? But sure enough, there was a problem in the system and a quick adjustment, and all of a sudden the levels were back down. But it's a great example. Like, it's a really helpful diagnostics tool for sure.
Yeah.
And even the
So-
best buildings sometimes.
Anyway, I thought that's funny. Anyway, my question is, we see a lot of patients who are coming in because there's water intrusion and mold. And what I see, and maybe some of the other occupational environmental health doctors, people are really hung up on this mycotoxin, which is based on misguided studies many years ago in Cleveland. I won't go into all that, but anyway, my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that this little bit of water intrusion or mold that grows in a corner on a tile is not giving off a significant or any measurable mycotoxins into the environment, and that actually the whole mycotoxin thing would be much more in a situation where you have a Katrina or a lot of significant water damage. And so I've been trying to dissuade people from the mycotoxin, and particularly since there are alternative doctors out there who want to measure urine mycotoxins, which may or may not coordinate with that. So I know you mentioned it twice in your talk, so I wonder if you have more information about that. That would be appreciative.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. This is something where I mentioned when I was talking about moisture, like we see a lot of health outcomes associated with moisture, but we don't see that clear pathway. So you're right, like a lot of people will say mycotoxins, some people will think endotoxins, some people will think an increase in allergens, say dust mites that can absorb moisture and grow that way. I don't think I've seen any conclusive evidence on which pathway is the dominant pathway between moisture and ill health. I think right now it's mostly a lot of hypotheses for the different pathways, but I personally haven't seen one that is kind of like the conclusive, this links to this, links to that. Really, in the building space, we try to control moisture just for the myriad of health. And even moisture, like in the building space, that is poorly understood. Like it's actually people think it's air moisture. It's really the surfaces that we try to control to prevent all of the bad things that can happen in turn. But
well, my understanding too is that the moisture is the key thing, as you've said, and that it's leading to somehow deterioration in the building materials and something coming off, not necessarily the mycotoxins. So the direction to just deal with the moisture. So there've been several articles out about moisture alone precipitating asthma. So thanks.
No, thank you for bringing that up and the story. I appreciate it. Very interesting.
And we do also have a tie-in question by Dr. David Diamond about endotoxin measurements.
Sorry, what about them? Just in terms of like research, perhaps, or
and if there's generally an available method of measuring them in terms of indoor air quality.
This is not something I do personally. Like I use more of kind of the low cost environmental sensors, and then with the anything related to moisture. So going back to what I just alluded to, the challenges of so there's the challenges of the pathways between like moisture and health. And then in terms of actually identifying a mold problem in a building, that is really hard to do for numerous reasons, like measurement technology and interpretation of it. What we look for in the building science community, again, this is the same theme as just we look at it if there's moisture, there's a problem. And so people often think like relative humidity is the right way to measure a moisture problem in a building. That's often misleading. If there's moisture in the air, it doesn't directly lead to health. Or sorry, if there's moisture in the air, it doesn't lead to necessarily mold. So we try to look at surfaces in buildings because that's where the precipitation of the moisture into available moisture for, say, mold to grow or something else to grow is the problem. So we look in buildings at surface moisture. You can measure that with a kind of in situ water activity sensor, which I could try to link you to after if we want to follow up over the messages. But then what I mentioned to, you can get an attachment for your phone. It's like a lower grade level of a more industrial thermal imaging camera, and that allows you to go around and identify cold areas, which often leads to moisture being available for these other types of things to happen. But again, the whole pathway between moisture and health, like what is it causing the problem? And then trying to measure those intermediate problems are really challenging and not well understood. So we typically look for available moisture, which happens at a surface in one of those two ways, the equilibrium, relative humidity, or the thermal imaging in buildings for diagnostic purposes. So sorry, that was a lot and not so well articulated, but feel free to email me. I can also link you to some of the devices that are lower cost that are available to use for that.
Perfect. That would be fantastic. And thank you so much for, a wonderful talk. I really think that it was very, very eye-opening for,
Thank you.
I think I speak on behalf of most, if not all of us. I think it was really phenomenal. We do want to be mindful of the time. We have about 3 minutes until our next presentation. So thank you so much again, Dr. Dedesko, and hopefully we can kind of forward some of the additional questions to you.
Yeah, absolutely, please. And thank you so much for having me again. Thank you for your attention and the wonderful questions and anecdotes. And enjoy the rest of the conference.